Hey, it's Jordan here with legendary independent journalist Michael Tracey. You've been with the Young Turks, you've freelanced at many other places, and now you are basically voyaging out on your own. We have podcasts to look forward to, written articles, maybe other things. So obviously, we'll get to what you're working on later. Want to start? I personally like saying "I told you so." You know, you're supposed to be cool and not say that, but I like saying it. So unless something radically changes, it seems that the Russian collusion theory that you've been attacked for journalistically questioning for the last 2.5, 3 years seems to be getting to a point now where evidence would point to there being no firm evil cabal between the Trump campaign or Russian. Doesn't mean, like we've always said, President Trump doesn't have some financial dealings with Russia that need to be looked at. But what do you think? Because now I'm seeing, people like Congressman Jerry Nadler say, well, even if it doesn't come back, even if Mueller doesn't come back with collusion, that doesn't mean there wasn't collusion. You have others. David Corn, I love, from Mother Jones, saying, well, it was never about collusion in the first place. You've been, you've kind of been steadfast the last few years, along with a few others. What do you think of now the goalposts moving in terms of Russian collusion?
Well, first of all, Jordan, good to see you. Looking better than ever. You're a beautiful man. I don't think anyone would deny that.
Thank you for dressing up so profoundly for me.
Well, I should also clarify, I did not dress up specifically for this event. I don't hold Jordan in that high regard.
That's fine.
High regard, but not that high, not suit high. Anyway, I mean, it's incredible how top Democrats who have been at the forefront of spinning this for 2.5 years are just drastically changing their tune, and nobody thinks that there's anything inconsistent about what they're saying. Take, for instance, Adam Schiff. Adam Schiff is the leading proponent of Russia collusion, hysteria, blah, 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 in the Congress. And what's he been doing for the past couple weeks? He's been going on all these Sunday shows and all these TV interview shows where he's one of the staple guests and saying that there's already ample evidence for collusion in the public record. So he's saying that whether it's the Don Jr. meeting in Trump Tower that was revealed in July 2017, or it's stuff pertaining to the Moscow Trump Tower dealing, all that is already sufficient to establish that collusion exists. So he's laying the groundwork for claiming that collusion has already been established, notwithstanding whatever Mueller comes up with.
Right.
Now, Mueller's investigation is what Schiff and his acolytes have been saying must be protected with every fiber of our being, or democracy's going to crumble. That's what they've been saying for the past 2 years. Mm-hmm. And, 2.5 years if you stretch back even further before the special counsel was actually initiated. But so now they're saying that the special counsel was never even necessary.
Right.
Remember, MoveOn.org, when Trump was talking about firing Sessions, or when he did fire Sessions ultimately after the midterms, MoveOn.org launched a email rallying cry out to its membership saying, we all need to take to the streets and demand that Trump not fire Jeff Sessions. I'm not making this up. One of the leading progressive groups in the entire United States called on its membership to rally in defense of Jeff Sessions. That actually happened. That's how distorted the contemporary political climate is, because they thought that Jeff Sessions being fired was going to jeopardize the Mueller investigation. That's how important it was regarded to protect Mueller investigation. And now you got Adam Schiff, Gerald Nadler, Ted Lieu is another one. Ted Lieu, he gave a hilarious statement on Chris Cuomo's show on CNN 2 weeks or so ago, where he said that it would be my preference. I want Mueller not to come up with collusion because it'd be better for the country if the president hadn't actually colluded with the foreign power. Come on. Does anybody actually believe that Ted Lieu and his kin are going to be happy if all their wildest theories about the Trump presidency are just utterly underlined and Trump is allowed to claim vindication? That's another irony here. This is something that I've been pointing out from the outset, as well as the handful of others who you kind of alluded to. By whipping up this confabulated and faulty criticism of Trump, what you're doing is you're giving Trump grounds to claim vindication later on, which is actually going to empower him. Mm-hmm. So when the Mueller report comes out, or whatever Mueller finally states once this is over, there's a very good chance now that Trump is going to have legitimate grounds to claim vindication because nobody is going to be charged with actually conspiring with Russians to influence the 2016 election.
I also think it's going to give him the ability to whip up his base that there has been a deep state conspiracy against him.
And to some extent, there has. I wouldn't use the phrase deep state because Sean Hannity is now a big, he's now a big proponent of the deep state theory, and his conception of deep state is not the deep state that actually exists. Right? But at core, there is something there. Right? Think about Andrew McCabe. I sent you the column that I wrote for the Daily News 2 weeks ago or so on Andrew McCabe, who was the deputy director of the FBI, and then once Comey was fired, he was the acting director of the FBI. So he was the most powerful law enforcement official in the country. And what's come out recently with this book tour that he's on, he has this book about how the FBI navigated the turmoil of the Trump presidency. Andrew McCabe said that he and Rod Rosenstein, who was then the deputy attorney general, so the two of the most powerful unelected law enforcement officials in the entire country conspired to potentially extra-legally remove Trump from office. Now, you could hate Trump. You could think he's the gravest menace of all time. But you're going to empower the FBI and the Department of Justice to decide for themselves that the democratic will or the general populace can be overridden and the president can be removed? I mean, Trump was elected. Right. Yeah, it was an electoral college thing, didn't win the popular vote, blah, blah, blah. By the constitutional framework that we have in place now for presidential elections, Trump was elected, okay? So Andrew McCabe and Rod Rosenstein took it upon themselves, along with other people in the FBI who haven't actually been identified yet, to basically plan how to mount a coup. And I say the word coup deliberately because contemplating whether to invoke the 25th Amendment wouldn't have obviously been legal just because the 25th Amendment is in the Constitution, right? John Yoo, during the George W. Bush years, came up with all kind of cockamamie schemes to justify torture, and he used the constitutional authorities to justify that. So just because it's in the Constitution and somebody's citing the Constitution doesn't mean it's actually legal. So I think it's pretty clear that the 25th Amendment was not designed to remove somebody who you believe might have done some corrupt deal or you think might be compromised or whose foreign policy views you just agree with, because they thought that his foreign policy orientation toward Russia was an indication of his being compromised. So in essence, they were objecting to his foreign policy views. That's not what the 25th Amendment was designed for. So if the most powerful law enforcement officials in the entire federal apparatus were conspiring to invoke some obscure mechanism to remove the president, that creates a hugely ominous precedent. And one way I've been trying to tell, quote, progressives that they should care about this is, think of President Bernie coming into power, and maybe he has some foreign policy initiative that the FBI, Department of Justice, intelligence community doesn't like. They could use the same methods to thwart him.
You are aware Bernie and Jane Sanders honeymooned in Russia.
I am aware. I've seen grainy clips of that from 1987 or whenever it was, but those are, I like those clips.
I'd like to ask you, because you pointed this out. I just referenced your tweets because you're a one-man Twitter machine. But
for better or worse, I guess.
At Michael Tracey.
At M Tracey.
You pointed out for a long time, and I agree with this, that it's not just about like the factual inaccuracy and the mass speculation about collusion, but you're poking at a nuclear armed power, and now we're seeing Putin is now making direct threats against the United States about missile, what Russia could do. You have Trump backing out of the 1980s agreement that Reagan and Russia pushed. So the things that you and others were warning against, we're seeing really this tension and this buildup that it doesn't seem to me, Jerry Nadler is so worried about that Adam Schiff is so worried about that, and certainly not our friend Rachel Maddow is so worried about that.
The only one who's worried about it is Tulsi. Yes. And she's going completely against the grain relative to the rest of the Democratic caucus in Congress and relative to liberal pundits and everybody in the entire center-left ecosystem. She's the only one, including Bernie, frankly, who is pointing out the danger of how this domestic political hysteria has created a warped climate such that Trump now has free rein to act extraordinarily belligerently toward Russia because there's this presumption that he's friendly to Russia based on his rhetoric and the performance he gave at the Helsinki summit and whatever else. There's this false perception that Trump is in league with Russia. So when he actually implements policies that are antagonistic toward Russia, nobody raises any questions other than Tulsi.
Right.
And she's been ostracized by much of the liberal establishment. So, the INF Treaty would be one example. The sending lethal arms to Ukraine would be another example, which he authorized in, I believe, December of 2017. Remember there was this big controversy in 2016 over whether Trump authorized representatives to alter the Republican platform?
About Ukraine.
About not sending lethal arms to Ukraine. Sure enough, Trump didn't abide by whatever that platform initiative was, and he sent lethal arms to Ukraine. But there's nobody saying, hey, maybe this is unnecessarily escalating tensions with the nuclear armed power because they're so invested in this faulty and warped domestic narrative. And that's something that I've been trying to warn about from the very beginning. And I don't like to say I told you so. I mean, I don't want to claim vindication in that way. I think it's a little cheap and cheesy. However, what I will say is I think it was evident from the outset that this would be the outcome. And all you had to do was try to be a little impartial, a little objective about the factual record, about the evidentiary basis for a lot of the claims that were being made about Trump. I always said I wanted a rational, robust critique of Trump. He has authoritarian tendencies. He's in hock to the business elite of the Republican Party. There's plenty to criticize. So by elevating this false criticism, you're giving him cover to get away with all manner of other stuff.
And I also think if you just look at the business transactions, there's a lot more evidence that he's making policy towards Saudi Arabia and Israel that would be favorable to his business interests than Russia. Yes, if he was making deals while running for office for Trump Tower in Moscow, is that ethical? No. But is it illegal? No, not that I know of. The other thing that I wanted to ask you about is, I think along with who knows, maybe Mueller has something and we'll all have egg on our face, but it's this new McCarthyism. So I want to bring up the thing about Rania Khalek, who's a journalist based in the Middle East. She does viral videos that, are very critical of the United States government, the United States intelligence agencies, particularly, the Russia hysteria. She's been critical of U.S. coup attempts in Venezuela. And we started seeing people even attacking Congressman Ro Khanna for the temerity to retweet her, And then all of a sudden you see the collaboration of CNN doing this ridiculous report on, oh my God, breaking news, they're funded by Russia, which wasn't a secret. Rania Khalek's group, I think it's called In the Now. So what are your thoughts on this new McCarthyism? Because I've seen it. I know Matt Taibbi's been called a Russian agent, Aaron Maté, Michael Tracey, Glenn Greenwald, Jimmy Dore. There is really this McCarthyism that's this almost like this digital, I would call it a digital posse.
Whenever people accuse me of being a Kremlin agent or something, I keep telling them I'm waiting for the check to arrive, but it hasn't come yet.
Because you do have a growing Patreon. Good plug for your Patreon.
Yeah. Patreon.com/mtracy. Yeah. Tracy with an E. All my life, people have been misspelling my last name, and
First world problem.
Yes.
Keep going.
So, the Rania example is just one of many. They're indicative of a total corrosive impact that is now ingrained in much of the populace. And I'm thinking back to 2017 when I was going to all these Democratic town halls. When I would be in, Northern California somewhere at a Republican town hall, and the most popular issue that the constituents who showed up wanted to discuss was Russia. They'd be waving their signs with, Trump hearts Putin, and all these kind of crazy iconographies that were called the Soviet era. It was just very absurd and farcical. But when you have so much of that being trumpeted so intensively for so long, eventually people are just going to, at a subconscious level, give over their critical faculties and just become a nerd to the hysterical tenor of it all. And so they don't raise any objections when somebody like Rania is the victim of a coordinated attempt from CNN and Facebook to basically oust her from one of the primary means of promulgating content now on the flimsiest of grounds, which weren't applied to other outlets. I think the violation supposedly was that on the Facebook page it wasn't disclosed that her outlet receives partial funding from some Russian
Which,
government
by the way,
entity.
is a standard for nobody else.
Right.
No other outlet. CNN is not made to say we are funded by AT&T, who has done mass surveillance all over the country. None of these outlets are made to say who they're funded.
And I think in general it would be good practice if outlets more publicly disclose where they receive funding, if it's from a government, if it's from some endowment, whatever it may be. So I don't have a problem with that. Yeah, I have a problem with the selectivity. I have a problem with how standards are applied for the sole purpose of punishing anybody who has the remotest, vaguest affiliation with Russia. Mm-hmm. And what people think is Russia now is like so expansive that you could have some, minor dealing with somebody who could be claimed to have a connection to the Russian government, 20 years ago, and that's as if you're this agent of the Russian state, which is also a farce.
And also playing devil's advocate. So a lot of people have criticized you as basically that you're pointing these things out. You're coming off like you're a Trump supporter, this and that. Yet I've heard you before criticize Trump. It just seems like because you're making this argument not to basically create an alternative narrative about a Russian collusion, that there's this tacit, you're defending Trump. I assume you're not a Trump supporter.
Every single day since, I don't know, June of 2016 or something, I have been accused of being a Trump supporter. I am so numb to it at this point. Because, not only is it demonstrably false, it's also not it doesn't logically follow from anything I've said about the Russia narrative. In fact, it's the inverse. It's the opposite. The people who have been making this criticism one of the defining traits of the Trump era are helping Trump. Because again, they're going to give him grounds to claim vindication. Mm-hmm. And they're drowning out other legitimate criticisms of Trump. So don't call me a Trump supporter if you've been once screaming nonstop about Russia and now you're giving Trump a weapon.
So yeah, it sounds like your argument is really go after Trump on legitimate things, because there's plenty, not a Cold War reenactment.
Right, exactly. I've been going at Trump hard on Venezuela because he sounds like George W. Bush. Mm-hmm. He delegated that whole thing to Pence and Bolton and Pompeo.
And Elliott Abrams.
Right, and Elliott Abrams, who's one of the quintessential neocons. Trump actually blocked Elliott Abrams from being appointed to the administration in early 2017 because he knew that Abrams was a neocon and presumably didn't want him affiliated with the administration. That's changed. Been intensely critical of that. I could go down the list. I mean, aspects of Syria policy. Again, I just gave you criticisms of Trump taking an excessively antagonistic line toward Russia. Mm-hmm. So there's plenty to criticize just in the realm of foreign policy alone, not to say anything about domestic.
And I also think it's never covered because everybody's focused on Russia. Trump has doubled and tripled down on Obama's drone war, which only creates more terrorism. There's this theory, we're not sending in ground troops, it's drones. No, I mean, you're killing, the numbers are all over the place, but you're killing tens of thousands, maybe more, of brown people all over the world. Yeah, maybe you're not sending American troops in to do it, but you're radicalizing people, because I know if my brother or my sister or my family member was blown up in school or going on a bus or whatever, I might be kind of pissed off.
Yeah, and the rate of civilian casualties has gone up substantially, yes, even in the more conventional warfare and the ISIS war and things. Mm-hmm. But on foreign policy, it's complicated with Trump because look at Afghanistan. We're now closer to a peace deal with the Taliban than at any time since 2001. That includes the entire tenure of Obama. Right. He's withdrawing troops from Syria against the wishes of the vast majority of the national security establishment, to the point where James Mattis, who is maybe the most popular member of his administration, resigned in disgust. Mm-hmm. North Korea, the most recent summit was a bit of a setback, but you would have to expect setbacks over the course of groundbreaking diplomatic negotiations with a very isolated leader like Kim. So you have to take that in totality And people often accuse me of being a Trump supporter or something because I would say, here's where there are some positive developments that you want to encourage, less belligerent tendencies that are more diplomatically oriented. And here are some bad things that you want to also take into consideration. But people aren't able to hold multiple ideas in their head at Trump because they're so blinkered by Trump as a persona.
But you've also brought up something when you mentioned Mattis. I think because Trump is such a departure from normal, United Corporations of America norms, where usually people are just as bad as Trump, but they don't tweet it and they don't sound like Trump. But we've gotten into this derangement where James Mattis is considered like the sound, reasonable thinking one in the room. George W. Bush, you have Joe Biden handing a Liberty Award to George W. Bush a couple months ago. I mean, there's a lot of people that in a normal civilized society would be in witness protection program, public relations wise. Now, because of Trump, Bill Kristol's been mainstreamed again, George W. Bush. People are saying, I miss the days of George W. Bush.
The intelligence services more broadly, I mean, they're the biggest cable news stars now. John Brennan, James Clapper, all these people have been utterly rehabilitated.
The FBI is amazing now.
Right, the FBI, Comey, McCabe raised hundreds of thousands of dollars when he was fired last year as if he was going to fall into destitution. Sure enough, his book has been #1 on the New York Times and Amazon bestsellers list now for since it came out. I mean, the guy's going to do well, but everybody latches on to whatever transient anti-Trump force is in the ether. Mm-hmm. And they don't have the ability to step back and look at bigger trends. Yeah. You mentioned Mattis. Mattis is one of the guys who convinced Trump to do this minor surge in Afghanistan in August 2017. Bear in mind that the Trump surge in Afghanistan was very small compared to the one Obama did. Mm-hmm. Which resulted in the deadliest year in Afghanistan for U.S. troops of the entire war in 2010 to 2011. So Obama's surge in Afghanistan a lot more than Trump, but people don't realize that because they just assume that Trump would have to have had the worst possible approach compared to Obama. I don't think it's necessarily the case. I think one of the few things that is consistent about Trump is that he does have a genuine aversion to over-deployment of military resources around the world. And he wants to withdraw those resources where viable. Now he's running up against resistance from within the bureaucracy. Syria would be an example. John Bolton has tried to undermine the order that he gave in Syria. I think John Bolton, I think, also had undermined the most recent Korea summit. Mm-hmm. And Trump is ultimately responsible for appointing John Bolton, who was the biggest Iraq war supporter and is still unrepentant about it. And Trump says Trump says he hates the Iraq war, yet he appoints Bolton.
Let me tell you.
That's something I wish a reporter would ask Trump.
Yeah.
I mean, that's something I would ask him, but nobody asks him decent questions. It's always about some incremental procedural Mueller thing that has no relevance in 2 weeks.
Right. Bernie Sanders just had a kickoff rally in New York, in Chicago.
I was there.
Okay. In New York you were there?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't see you. He was raking.
I went in the general crowd. I don't mingle with the media.
Okay.
I go with the normal people.
Okay. You don't like the fake news. No. So
you are fake news.
So I mean, bottom line, by the numbers, let's keep it real. If Joe Biden raised $10 million in a week, if Joe Biden had 1 million volunteers, all of these outlets would be calling the election. They would say, skip the Democratic primary, we need to put Joe Biden up against Bernie. But we're hearing a lot of the criticisms against Bernie. I think Jennifer Rubin wrote 2 hit pieces on him in one day.
Who cares what Jennifer Rubin thinks? Sorry to interject, but just as a side note, Jennifer Rubin in 2012 was one of the lead media propagandists for Mitt Romney. So she hates Trump now, but in 2012, if you follow this coverage closely, she was the biggest booster of Mitt Romney. It turned out that after the election, she admitted that she was lying on Mitt Romney's behalf at the Washington Post. And she was never penalized for it. Actually, she's been rewarded for it because she became one of the top, anti-Trump conservatives.
Yeah. And now progressive Chris Hayes has her on twice a week.
Oh, does he?
Yeah. So I want to ask you, because I read one of your pieces real quick, and I think you have legitimate concerns over some of the things Bernie's done so far, if you want to elaborate.
Okay, so I wrote a piece for Spiked.
And by the way, full disclosure, he is a Bernie bro. No, I'm kidding.
That's right. I voted for Bernie in 2016. I've always been public about that. That doesn't mean
even though in 2014 you did a tweet saying he had no
I
chance.
did one tweet saying I didn't think he had much of a chance in mid 2014, and people keep bringing it up. Yeah. Okay, I repudiate and disavow that tweet, all right? I voted for Bernie in 2016 because I'm a registered Democrat. I want to vote in Democratic primaries. It doesn't mean it's central to my identity, or I can't criticize Bernie, or I'm not striving to be objective in how I analyze how the campaign plays out, right? So since he announced the campaign last month, in the week subsequent, there were, I think, a couple of red flags that are going to be potential liabilities for him going forward. One is that he sent out this missive to his surrogates, basically giving credence to the whole Bernie bro notion that was concocted by his arch enemies in 2016. He was saying, don't harass anybody, don't abuse anybody, basically accepting the logic that he could be in any way responsible for how his supporters engage online. Mm-hmm. Really? The whole basis for the Bernie bro narrative in 2016 was journalists who disliked Bernie scouring Twitter and Reddit and saying, oh my God, this guy is abusing me and he hates women and won't Bernie disavow. No, that's insane.
Well, it was more insidious than that. It actually was hatched out of Hillary's campaign. If you read WikiLeaks, Hillary's campaign was planting this with the media, and the journalists picked it up.
And Olivia Nucci, remember this? She revealed that somebody pitched her a Bernie bro story, so whatever. But the point is that the basic logic of the whole Bernie bro storyline was a myth and a joke from the outset. So for him now to partially validate it, I think it's just going to boomerang on him, because at a certain point, we all know, the media, I think, is going to recognize sooner rather than later that he's the front runner. Mm. You know, Biden might be polling a little bit ahead of him in national polls, but it doesn't matter all that much. Bernie's got the most robust national organization. He almost won the Iowa caucus last time. Remember, he lost to Hillary in Iowa by, I think, was it at 1 point?
When you say almost lost, I mean, they
almost won.
Right, but they called the election when he was down 1/10 of a point. So
right, so I'm saying he came close to actually beating Hillary in Iowa in 2016.
I'm pointing out, I think, it's, you know, if looked into further, he might have won. But anyway,
I doubt it. But in any event, he then won New Hampshire by a huge margin. Yep. Those are the first two states. Yep. So he has a good chance to win the first two states, which in most circumstances would result in the media crowning you the presumptive nominee, right, or at least very close to being the presumptive nominee. So at a certain point, the media is going to recognize that he's a front runner. I wrote an article for The Spectator, which is a British magazine, in November of last year, saying it was basically saying, why isn't anybody calling Bernie the front runner? And I laid out all these reasons for why he's the clear front runner. So I think eventually the media is going to come around to that. They're going to melt down for the most part. They're going to, all the Hillary retreads are going to launch into overdrive, smearing him and trying to undermine him. I don't think it's going to particularly work. Could be wrong. You never know what could happen. You could, something crazy could come up. But one of the tactics they're going to use against him is to say, look at this anonymous troll behaving badly online who claims he's a Bernie supporter. A lot of the trolls that they accused of being Bernie bros ended up being like actual trolls, meaning they were not Bernie supporters, but they were posing as such to make Bernie look bad. But they're going to take the validation of the logic that he gave in this letter and use it against him. Mm-hmm. And my only point is, don't give any quarter to your most despicable opponents.
Right.
It's just going to give them more grounds to attack you.
Well, I also think there's a fallacy to it, because I think where he has been weak, and I've said this in 2016, when you're sending out an email, let's be kind and just be on policy and this and that, you're also putting aside the fact that, Hillary Clinton literally had a super PAC that was built on paid trolls on the internet doing exactly what they're claiming Bernie Sanders supporters are doing. And also, listen, I like Bernie, I don't hide it, but when I look online, I see the majority of people that are Bernie Sanders supporters criticizing Beto O'Rourke or Kamala Harris based on their policies. Yeah. But I think that it's been concocted and there's been this misdirection. Hillary Clinton was very masterful at this in 2016. When you questioned her on her Wall Street record or private speeches, that was a personal attack.
Right. And Bernie actually withheld a lot of the most potent attacks that he could have used in 2016 against Hillary until it was too late. Yeah. Remember, he famously said the emails were no big deal. I don't care about your damn emails. Mm-hmm. The emails ended up costing Hillary the election, according to her own supporters. The email investigation resulted in the Comey letter just prior to November. Mm-hmm. I was on Democracy Now! In May of 2016 saying, look, I know Bernie came out and said, don't worry about her damn emails, but her damn emails are the subject of an FBI investigation that's hugely publicized. We don't know how this is going to end. And sure enough, it came back to bite her, and now they say cost her the election. Right. So if Bernie was doing a proper job vetting Hillary, what he should have done is actually saying, you know what, maybe this is being overhyped, but at the same time, you're subject to an FBI investigation. So really from a standpoint of electoral liabilities, that's something we need to think about as Democrats if we want the Democrat to win.
Right.
But he wouldn't go there, and what happened? Even though he withheld those criticisms, now the Hillary people all say he was too mean to her, and he didn't do enough to help her, he didn't unite the party, blah, blah, blah. So his withholding those criticisms didn't accomplish anything. Mm-hmm. Because the people who hate him are going to continue hating him regardless.
Do you think, I mean, obviously you can't get in his head, but do you think he's trying to, in some way, play ball with the Democratic Party establishment?
You don't have to get into his mind to know that he's doing that. He co-authored an op-ed in the New York Times with Chuck Schumer. Yeah. He appeared at events, basically endorsing Andrew Cuomo. He is very cordial with all of his colleagues in the Senate. So, remember, he did that Unity tour with Tom Perez in 2017. I don't know if you might have covered that.
Not on the road, but I understand.
Okay.
Which was frankly embarrassing for Tom Perez. Bernie went out like crazy cheers, and Tom Perez goes out, and his mother.
It was awkward for everybody, frankly.
Yeah.
So, of course, he's playing ball. And, on one level, it makes sense because you got to unite the party coalition to some extent if you want to win the Democratic nomination.
Well, I think he might be also positing that, hey, I got to get at least 10% of Hillary Clinton voters to come over to me if I'm going to have any chance.
Yeah, but I think he doesn't. I don't want to get into the mode where I'm like giving campaign advice to him because I don't feel that's like my proper role. But if I were giving him advice, what I would say is,
well, I mean, you're dressed pretty well.
I know. I look 364 days out of the year. I don't look this good.
Yeah.
So you're.
Well, I didn't say you look good. But yeah.
Well, either way. You should be very honored that you're viewing me in this entire. Well, thank you. But if he, what I would say to him is, yo, Bernie, do what you've always done, because that garnered you a huge base of support. Maybe make some tactical adjustments along the way. But don't feel like you have to make special appeals to these people who hate you. Mm-hmm. They're going to use the pressure that Hillary used against your supporters last time, saying, oh, isn't Donald Trump so horrible, you got to unite around the nominee. That same pressure is going to be there if you win the nomination, if you come close to winning the nomination this time. So you don't have to get out of your comfort zone and make like awkward appeals to all these Hillary people, because they're not going to tolerate voting for Trump. I mean, as much as they don't like you, they don't like Trump even more. So don't worry about making these kind of awkward, again, entreaties to these people. And then another thing I mentioned in that piece, which I think is also worth noting, is Venezuela. Actually, before I get to that, let me mention the racial stuff. And I want to talk about this carefully because I know how inflammatory it can be.
Be careful.
I'm going to try to be very careful. Well, so in his first round of interviews after the announcement, he said, I agree. He said something to the effect of, I agree that the 2016 campaign was too male and too white. Now, from a tactical standpoint, it makes perfect sense to want to make more inroads with racial minority demographics to win the Democratic primary. To win the Democratic primary, you have to have a multiracial coalition. There's no bones about it. So he's been going to South Carolina. He's meeting with the Black Democratic Caucus there. He was on the Breakfast Club this morning, which I saw some of, which was funny. He's doing some legitimate things to try to expand his appeal among different demographics that weren't as strong for him in 2016. Fine. But you don't have to couple that with this kind of bad faith admission that your previous campaign was too male and too white, which is what, again, all his arch enemies were saying in 2016. So you're giving them ammunition to just use the same talking points against you again.
Well, I also think, I agree with you in some part, but I also think it's kind of been overstated that he had a problem with African-American voters, because if you just look at it, I mean, he was up against the Clinton machine that already had a firm, essentially, stranglehold is the wrong word, a strong, commitment and support from the black community nationwide. I mean, Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton were going down to churches for 20 years. I saw it on the campaign trail. Right or wrong, I think wrong, because frankly, Bill Clinton and with Hillary Clinton's support did a lot of things that were not advantageous to the African American community. But People in Mississippi, in Georgia, in Arkansas, a lot of them didn't even know who Bernie Sanders was, talking specifically about African Americans. So I think the primary schedule was front-loaded to favor those states, and he wasn't a known quantity. So yes, he did get his clock cleaned in a lot of these states, but I don't think it was necessarily that it was they hated Bernie as much as they, especially the biggest voting demographic in the Democratic Party is actually African American women. Older African American women in particular. So I think it was overstated. And secondly, to your point, I do think he had a bit of too many old white guys running his campaign. But where I disagree with kind of the messaging that's gone out is he had a problem. Because if you look, I mean, Nina Turner was a major surrogate for him. Cornel West, Danny Glover, and he has policies. I think Bernie, where he has had an issue, and I was talking to Ty about this, he hasn't connected how his policies would, for example, break up the big banks. Well, the 2008 global financial crash, disproportionately, foreclosures happened more on African Americans than white people. So I think he needs to make those connections to his policies with the black community.
I just think he could take reasonable steps to diversify his campaign staff, which is good, without then conceding that the previous campaign was too white and too male, because that feeds into the bro narrative.
Right.
And I don't think the bro narrative had any basis at all. So you're giving the people who would wield the bro narrative as a cudgel against him additional ammunition. And that's what he should be.
You're making me dizzy with these words. Cudgel, propagate, confabulate. I can't handle it. I want to move on. So,
and the Venezuela thing really quickly,
Yeah.
because that was also mentioned in the article. So Bernie has been, there was a Saturday a couple weeks ago when Trump, Bolton, Abrams, and the whole crowd trying to engineer regime change in Venezuela did this phony aid delivery effort where they amassed aid convoys on a bridge in the Colombia-Venezuela border. And of course, that was just a pretext to engineer the overthrow of the government. Nobody thinks that Trump is sincerely committed to providing humanitarian aid to struggling Venezuelans. But on that same day, Bernie put out this statement, through a couple of tweets saying Maduro must let in all aid. Mm-hmm. So he's basically giving cover to this Trump regime change scheme. And it doesn't make sense for Bernie because his biggest electoral asset, I think, or one of them anyway, is the fact that he's been so consistent for so long. Mm-hmm. He's been saying the same damn thing, almost to the point of being tedious, for decades. This is a guy who held events with Noam Chomsky in Burlington, Vermont in the 80s on the harms of U.S. foreign policy in Latin America. You're going to tell me that anybody should seriously believe that he's now on board with a Trump regime change initiative? Elliot Abrams, really? Elliot Abrams actually orchestrated some of the very foreign policy initiatives that Bernie inveighed against with Chomsky in the 80s. So it doesn't make sense because it's not consistent with who he has always seemed to be. And I don't know. Maybe he has evolved somewhat. It's become more establishmentarian on foreign policy. It's true that he supported Iraq sanctions in the 90s. He supported the bombing of Kosovo in the 90s. He's kind of a little bit of a normie on foreign policy. Tulsi's a lot more adroit than him in that area. But it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and you're kind of giving away your most precious asset, I feel. He could have easily just not say anything.
Yeah. I want to move to Tulsi because, to me, obviously the establishment, when I say the establishment, we're talking the banks, pharmaceutical companies, fossil fuel companies, corporate media, they're all one and the same, in my view. Obviously, they're scared of a President Sanders and Medicare for all, but I almost feel like they might feel almost equally, if not more threatened by a President Gabbard, because if there's one thing that the establishment does not want even mentioned, it's the permanent war economy. Right. And Bernie is not as strong as Congresswoman Gabbard. What are your thoughts? Because obviously she's been pretty much blacklisted. I mean, CNN is going to do a town hall now next week, I believe, back to back with John Delaney, and I think they're doing one.
They're doing one with Tulsi and Delaney next week?
They're doing one. 7 o'clock is going to be John Delaney. 8 o'clock will be Tulsi Gabbard. 9 o'clock will be Pete Buttigieg, the mayor of South Bend.
He's actually kind of interesting. I don't know if you...
No, I know, yeah. But, yeah. But I think that, to me, they are very, very scared of even talk of regime change, ending wars. She's even mentioned things about closing down bases around the world. What are your thoughts on what they're doing as far as Tulsi Gabbard.
You know what it is? The moment she announced. So I interviewed her in February of 2017, prior to going to the Young Turks. So I didn't actually write the piece that I was planning on writing because my plans changed. But just after she returned from her trip to Syria with Dennis Kucinich on a fact-finding mission, essentially, where she met with Assad, yes, as everybody and their mother knows, but she met also, and Dennis Kucinich pointed this out to me at the time, they met with opposition forces as well. So it wasn't as if they were on an explicit mission to prop up Assad. They were going to understand the nature of the extremely bloody and destructive and disastrous war in Syria, which hadn't just killed hundreds of thousands of people, it was creating a refugee crisis that is still upending Europe right now.
Right.
So, but the moment that that trip was reported, she got cast as Assad's stooge. That is the thing that most people know about Tulsi. Most Americans, if they know about her at all, know her as the friend of Assad. You saw this on the View appearance with Meghan McCain, who I think explicitly said that when I think of Tulsi Gabbard, I think of Assad. Barry Weiss on the Joe Rogan podcast, remember this? Yeah. And Joe said something, vaguely complimentary of Tulsi, and Barry was like, oh my God, her? She's Assad's toady. And then Barry couldn't even define what the word toady is or spell it correctly, which is one of the most humiliating things I've ever seen on YouTube. And that's saying a lot. By the way, Barry, talk to me at some point. I want to discuss these issues with you, okay? She won't. I mean, she attacked me on anti-Semitism stuff.
The Tracey challenge. Yeah.
Well, I've challenged Ben Shapiro and I've challenged Barry. Let's have a discussion about identity politics, which they all claim to hate, and anti-Semitism and Jewish issues. Anyway, that's a rabbit hole. Tulsi, the moment that she went on that trip, was branded as a dictator coddler. There's almost nothing you can be branded with in American politics that is more intractable than that, or more indelible, meaning you can't get rid of that branding once it's applied to you. So when she announced her presidential campaign, sort of haphazardly, I don't think that her staff even knew that she was going to announce it that night on Van Jones. Immediately you saw the wheels start spinning where it was saying, Assad's best friend in Congress announces presidential bid. And once that perception gets implanted in the public, it's really hard to do anything about, which is why I've been trying to counteract it. I've been on a bunch of different types of media saying how horribly unfair and smearing that is of her. In fact, it was really courageous of her to do that because she must have known that that was going to be the consequence.
And they didn't call John McCain an apologist when he stood on a stage
No,
in
of
Ukraine
course.
with Nazis.
No,
So.
and then her resignation from the DNC was also in 2016 when she endorsed Bernie, was another act of courage. Even if you just take those two acts of courage, it's much more courage than most people in politics have ever demonstrated in their lives. Yeah. And she's only 37 years old. Right. So I think there's a through line of actual integrity there to her, and also a sense that she's sort of fed up with the trivialities of American politics, and she wants to orient her approach around foreign policy, which is something that I personally have always found to be really needed and refreshing, because the United States is the world's top military hegemon. It has bases everywhere. It spends more on the military than the next, 10 countries combined? I don't have the exact figure. Something to that effect. If you think foreign policy is an afterthought, which Bernie often does, I question your judgment, because the main thing that you have unilateral control over as the president is your commander-in-chief capacities. Under Article 2 of the Constitution, you could do almost anything you want on the world stage and militarily. So if you haven't thought deeply about how you're going to wield that unbelievably awesome power, I kind of question where you're coming from, and I think she feels the same way. So she has been the recipient of so much scorn now because she's actually causing to collapse a lot of the mythology that surrounds the American military apparatus.
Right.
Whether it's North Korea, where she was actually one of the people, along with Ro Khanna, who were trying to encourage Trump's best tendencies diplomatically with the negotiations with Kim, whether it's Venezuela, where she was the first major politician in the entire country to say the United States should not be in Venezuela. Right. She's done it with regard to Russia now, where I think she's really shrewdly and courageously called attention to the new Cold War that is being stoked by this domestic frenzy that we spent the earlier part of the conversation talking about. So she does represent a threat to their interests in a lot of ways. I don't know that I would be necessarily conspiratorial and say that that automatically explains why she's gotten such negative coverage, but it's obviously a factor, and they don't want her to gain traction because, again, she represents a threat to their interests, and she is an influence. If her influence grows, it's going to cause a lot of political figures to kind of reassess how they discuss these issues and the posture of America in the world.
And last question, I know currently there's a bidding war for your services. The New York Times, Washington Post, AP, Fox News, MSNBC, they all, calling your agent, mass meetings. What are you up to? Where can people find you? And what are you working on?
Well, I'm working on a bunch of things. I don't know there's a bidding war, but thank you for creating that false scenario. I'm writing for different outlets. I gave you that, the article I wrote for Spiked. I'm an independent contractor for different outlets. I'm writing some stuff for, I don't want to, say ahead of time, but I'm writing some stuff that's going to be coming out soon. I have a book that's in the works that's like a long way off, so I don't even want to discuss it. Don't even ask me any more questions about it. And I have a Patreon that's going to subsidize a video podcast type thing where I'm not going to be like ranting at the video camera like you, which is your specialty. I admire you for that.
Will your podcast be called Contraire?
I think it's going to be called like MTP. So like Meet the Press, but it's like M. Tracey Podcast.
Okay.
I don't know yet. I'm just floating that idea. But no, I'm gonna. That's what I'm doing.
Cool. Well, I'm glad I had you. Definitely follow him.
I'm exhausted now.
Definitely had him at Michael Tracey. He's over 100,000 Twitter followers. So
M. Tracey, not
M.
Michael
Tracey, excuse me. He's arrived. And very omnipresent work. I think you held your flank on RussiaGate, and I think you and many others are going to be proved right. And honestly, at the end, it's not about who's right or wrong. It's about, when you're journalists, it's not supposed to be a mass game of speculation and hysteria. It's supposed to be fact-based, evidence-based. Not, how do we create a Cold War reenactment, which is why Rachel Maddow has very high ratings, because they're stoking into the existing base of fear among a lot of these readers, viewers, and then some. So thank you, sir. We'll be in touch.
Yes. So long, everybody.
Hope you enjoyed that last video. Hop on over to statuscoup.com where you can sign up for our email list and become a member for as low as $5 to $10 a month. Membership is how we grow. That's statuscoup.com/join. And remember, join our email list so we can grow the revolution with you.